Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well this afternoon. Hope everybody's staying well and safe and not too bored. Again, as always, I want to apologize that we have to do class this way. I don't like it, and I'm sure you don't like it either, but we're going to do the best we can. This is Psych 301 Research, Design, and Methodology. Okay, and you've been working on your stats quizzes. Some of you sent it to me instead of the TA, but it got forwarded to the TA. So those grades should be up, I hope, by midnight tonight. You should be able to see your grades on Stats Quiz 3. So I hope the only thing we have left is going to be the final exam here. So our lecture today is survey research. Part 3. So we'll mostly get done, I think, with survey research today. That's our goal. Well, if you recall, what we were talking about last time were the factors to consider when evaluating surveys. Surveys are also called polls. And we'd gone through the first 5 of those. And so that's where we're going to start today. Is we're going to start on the next one. Let's underline this. Now, what we're going to try and explain, and we're going to come back to these today, and I hope these are big enough for most of you to see, is why were these polls in the 2016 presidential election so far off from the actual values? Almost everybody predicted Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. And here are a number of states, and this is the average of the polls in the week before the election. And then here's how the election came out. And you can see in almost all the cases, there was a huge shift from what was predicted to Donald Trump, much outside the margin of error. The margin of error is plus or minus 3% on most of these polls, and we're getting values outside of that. Why is that? Well, at the end of the lecture today, I hope we'll be able to explain it. But what we're going to talk about now is the next factor to consider when evaluating surveys, and that is number 6, type of question asked, by which I mean open versus closed. Type of question asked, open versus closed. Okay, so what do I mean by these two things? Let's define them. What is first a closed question? A closed question is a question in which answers are provided. So if I wanted to find out who people wanted to vote for the Democratic presidential nomination, and I wanted to make it a closed question, what I would say is, if the election were held today, for which of the following candidates would you vote? Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, Kamala Harris, maybe a few others. But it would be like a multiple choice question. Okay, that's a closed question where we provide answers to people. The opposite of a closed question is an open question, and this is a question in which answers are not provided. So that would be like a short answer question like we had on midterm 1. And there, if I wanted to ask the question about the presidential election, what I would say is, if the presidential election were held today, for whom would you vote? And then people are allowed to say whatever they want. Now, each one has some good things about it and some bad things about it. Closed questions are easier to score, but may bias respondents to respond in the way the researcher wishes. Closed questions are easier to score, but may bias respondents to respond in the way the researcher wishes. So, most people who do survey research do use closed questions, and they like closed questions for the same reason your professors like multiple choice tests, is it's easy to grade them. You can get the computer to score them for you. You don't actually have to do any grading, and so that's the good thing about them. Another good thing is it kind of eliminates ambiguous answers. let's say I wanted to ask people, what do you think is the biggest problem facing America today? And let's say I ask that as an open question. And one person says the falling stock market, another person says unemployment, third person says inflation, the fourth person says economic problems. Well, all those other things that I mentioned, unemployment and the stock price and inflation, those are economic problems. So how do you combine those? Maybe when the person who said economic problems was thinking about the stock market price or something else, but now do you keep those separate, or you try and lump them together, or what do you do? So that's another reason why open questions can be hard to score. But because you, the researcher, are providing the answers to the closed questions, that means you can use that to get people to respond the way you want. And so let me give you an example of this. This is from this Michigan Survey Research Institute. And this was a survey done in 1974, I think. And the question was, what do you think is the most important problem facing this country today? And people, they first asked that as an open question, where people were allowed to say whatever they wanted to. And I'm listing these. These were 4 of the lowest responses. They all got less than 2% of responses when this was asked as an open question: energy crisis, public school quality, abortion, and pollution. And so all of the responses is 93%. So these have to be pretty low for most people. But then they did the survey again, and they did something, I don't know, maybe nasty, but what they did was they took these 4 responses that were among the lowest, and that's specifically why they chose them. They were among the lowest when asked as an open question, and made them the alternatives in a closed question, but they did offer the option of saying something other than these 4. So they asked people, what do you feel is the most important problem facing this country today? A, energy crisis, B, public school quality, C, abortion, D, pollution, or E, something else. And what you see is that, yeah, a lot of people will respond with the something else, but all of the percentages go way up for the 4 that they asked about. Much higher under the closed question than under the open question, and you're always going to get that. That's always what's going to happen if you change from an open to a closed. Whatever alternatives you decide to ask people, those are going to go way, way, way up. And so we'd have to say in this case, probably the open question is a more accurate representation of people people actually think than the closed question here. People only gave the closed question because the researcher had given those things as alternatives. Sometimes this is done deliberately. I remember a time when I was in high school, they had people from the Kansas Department of Health come and give us a lecture on the dangers of alcohol and how awful alcohol was. And then they gave us a survey as part of that we were supposed to fill out. And the first question on the survey is, do you ever drink alcohol, yes or no? And then the second question is, if you answered yes to question 1, that you drink alcohol, why do you drink alcohol? A, because it makes me feel more mature. B, because my friends pressure me into it. C, in order to forget my problems at work, at school, school, or D, in order to forget my problems at home. So in other words, if you ever have a drink of alcohol, the only possible reason that you could ever take that drink is because you have some deep pathology associated with you, and this is your chance to confess your pathology. So that made me mad, and so I offered my own little multiple choice quiz for them. I stopped taking the survey and said, why did you decide to take a job exaggerating the dangers of alcohol to high school students? A, you were picked on in high school, and this is your method of obtaining revenge. B, you're willing to say anything if you're paid enough. C, McDonald's put you on the do not rehire list. Or D, you have no morals whatsoever. Has to be one of those. Yeah, I was kind of a smart aleck when I was in high school. I'm embarrassed about it now, but they shouldn't have asked those questions, I don't think. All right, so that's the problem with the closed questions is they're easier to score, but it's really easy to get people to respond as you want them to respond in this case. I don't know if you remember from the lecture last time, we talked about a case where Levi's was claiming in their ads that in a fall fashion survey, 90% of all college students said that Levi's 501 jeans were in on campus. And what they had done is makes it sound like from the question that it was an open question where people could say whatever they wanted to, and spontaneously 90% of people said Levi's 501 jeans. Well, really, it was a closed question where they gave a bunch of weird alternatives, and the only really common item of clothing on the entire list was Levi's 501 jeans. So there's a case where they deliberately chose a closed question when it probably almost certainly should have been an open question. All right, but now let's talk about open questions. Open questions allow respondents to more accurately convey their sentiments, but they are harder to score and can constrain respondents by not legitimating answers the researcher intended to include. Open questions allow respondents to more accurately convey their sentiments, but they're harder to score and can constrain respondents by not legitimating answers the researcher intended to include. So what I mean by more accurately convey their sentiments is, since you're allowed to respond to anything you want in an open question, well, now the researcher can't bias you to respond in the way they want. As we discussed, they're harder to score because you can't use the computer to do it, and because it's going to be ambiguous in some cases how to lump the different open responses together. But let me talk about this last one, about not legitimating answers the researcher intended to include. So there was a survey done, again, by the Michigan Research Institute. Let me show you this. And it said, what are the most important events or changes to have occurred since 1930? And they first asked it as an open question here. And these are, of the responses, these are 5 of the most popular responses: World War II, exploration of space, JFK assassination, invention of computers, and Vietnam War. Now, the thing I want to point out is these were, like I said, 5 of the most popular answers. The least popular of the 5 was invention of computers, down at 1.4%. And that's when people could respond however they wanted to. It was an open question. So now they redid it as a closed question. I'm going to show you what that looks like. Now, like I said, whenever you go from an open question to a closed question, and they offered these 5 as the alternatives in the closed question, all of the percentages are going to go up. We'd be shocked if it didn't do that. But that's not the interesting thing here. All right, so all the percentages go up for all of them. But the interesting thing is that invention of computers, which is the lowest of the 5 in the open question, is the highest of the 5, 29.9%, on the closed question. So what's the deal? How come it was the lowest of the 5 on the open question, but the highest of the 5 on the closed question? I'll give you a second to think about that. Well, I think the likely reason is that if somebody were to call you up and do doing a survey and asked, what are the most important events or changes to have occurred since 1930, what you're going to do is go back and think about maybe your 8th grade U.S. history class and think about, okay, what happened? Well, there's World War II, and JFK got assassinated, and Vietnam War, and other things that were big headline events that make the history books. But invention of computers, that wouldn't have been like a big headline in the newspapers at the time. It typically is not discussed in history classes as a particular event. And even if it might have crossed your mind that that's the most important thing, you might think, oh, I don't know if they meant to include something like that, and I don't want to look stupid in front of the person who's asking me the question, so I'm not going to say that even if it crossed your mind. But if you make it an alternative in the closed question, then that tells people, no, that is a reasonable answer to give, and that's the sort of thing we are looking for, or things maybe that weren't big newspaper headlines when they happened, but were changes that occurred. So now by including that as the closed question, now people realize that, yeah, that's a legitimate answer to this question. So I think we would have to say, in this case, the closed question is probably a more accurate representation of what people actually think than the open question was. And that's usually, it's not like that. Okay, so what's my sort of take-home message about this? Take-home message about open versus closed questions. I'm going to say that closed questions are best used when there are a small number of possible legitimate answers to the question. Okay, so if there are only two people running for president, definitely I would recommend using a closed question in that case. I would say other instances where you'd want to use a closed question are like in candidate questions where you have a set number of candidates and people might not remember their names very well. That's best used for closed questions. In contrast, open questions are best used when there are many possible legitimate answers to a question. And so what are the most important events of the last 100 years? That would best be an open question. What are the most important political issues facing America today? That would be best as an open question, because there are many, many alternatives one could legitimately give for that. Okay, so that's what I would say about open versus closed questions. That's number 6. Okay, now we're ready for 7th factor to consider when evaluating surveys, and that is wording of the questions. Wording of the questions. Some questions are just going to be blatantly biased, like particularly if somebody's doing fundraising for a political issue. I've gotten things in the mail before it was fundraising for an anti-abortion group, and they had a survey that I was supposed to fill out as part of it. And when you get the survey, it says, "Do you believe that the murder of unborn children should be permitted?" And so they're obviously wording the question in such a way as to give an anti-abortion response in that case, just because they want to get you fired up to give them money. So that's not what we're talking about here, somebody who's blatantly trying to give a bad wording of the question to get a particular response. But people can really want to give good survey questions, and it turns out they don't word them very well. Here's one case where maybe it was just not written very particularly well. So this was some suggestion in the late 1980s. There were some people who were claiming that the Nazi Holocaust, the Nazi extermination of the Jews during World War II, never happened, that it was all a conspiracy or all made up. And so Gallup did a survey in the United States to see if people believed that. Did people really believe that the Holocaust never happened? So here's how they answered the question when they did this. Does it seem possible to you, or does it seem impossible, that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened? Now, this is a very confusing wording of the question, and it's hard to see what you should say in this case. If you think it happened, are you supposed to say it's possible that it happened, or are you supposed to say it's impossible, given the way of the wording? I think if you think it did not happen, you're supposed to say it's impossible that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened. But you can see it's very strangely worded. When they asked it this way, 22%, yeah, a lot, of people said it was possible that the Nazi extermination never happened. Now, this caused a lot of consternation, really. Almost, more than a fifth of the population really believes the Holocaust never happened. Come on. And it was thought that, well, maybe it's just that the question was worded so confusingly that people weren't sure what they were supposed to say. So they redid the survey trying to word the question more clearly. And the way they worded it is now, the second time is, does it seem possible to you that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened? Or do you feel certain that it happened? And now only 1% of people are saying it's possible it never happened. So clearly the first one was because people were confused about what they were supposed to say. Here the wording of the question gets probably what the right answer is. So one problem with wording the question, we can get this thing out. So here is some questions are so badly worded that subjects are confused as to how they should respond. And so that definitely is a potential problem. Okay, but let's say that you really are trying to word a good question. You're not trying to confuse people or anything. Are there problems with wording in that circumstance? Well, here's an interesting survey, I think. Let me bring it up here. So I don't know how well you can see this because the type's smaller, but let me read it for you. This is right after Hitler invaded Poland in 1939. That was the start of World War II in Europe. And at that time, in 1939, it wasn't clear whether the United States would enter the war or not. And so Gallup did a poll right after Hitler invaded Poland in 1939 and asked people, at the beginning of World War II in Europe, Americans were asked, do you think the United States will go into the war before it's over? And a plurality said yes, 41% said yes, 30% said no, 29% were undecided. Well, then they decided to ask the question again, but just reverse it. So this question is, do you think the United States will go into the war before it's over? So they switched it and said, do you think the United States will succeed in staying out of the war? Okay, just the opposite question. Well, you'd expect the yeses and nos just to switch, right? Because anybody who said yes, that they're going to go into the war, would say no to this question. Anybody who said no should say yes. So we'd expect the yes and no responses to switch, but that's not what happened. You can see here's the results. If you ask it, do you think the United States will succeed in staying out of the war? 44% say yes to that, 30% say no, and 26% are undecided. Well, what's going on here? You'll notice the yes response got most of the response, not most, but a plurality more than any other response in both questions. And what's going on is called the response acquiescence. Acquiescence is a strange word. Acquiescence is spelled ACQUIESCENCE. Response acquiescence effect. This is the tendency of subjects to say yes to questions they have thought little about. Tendency of subjects to say yes to questions they've thought little about. So for whatever reason, if it's a question where the person doesn't have a strong opinion, something where they don't really care very much one way or another, and it's a yes or no question, there is a bias on people's part to say yes. I'm not 100% sure why that is, but I presume it's because, well, most times when somebody asks you a question, like asking for permission to do something, they want you to say yes. And so if you don't really care one way or the other, you might as well make them happy and say yes. So I imagine that is where this bias comes from. But you can see this makes it super, super easy to bias the poll in the way that you want. Let's say you're a pro-gun control group who's doing a survey and you would like the survey to come out that most people want more gun control. Well, how would you word the question on your survey? Would you say, are you in favor of more gun control? Or would you say, are you opposed to more gun control laws? Well, you ought to ask, are you in favor of more gun control laws? Because people are going to say yes if they don't have a very strong opinion. So that's likely to get you the most yes responses. Similarly, if you were opposed to more gun control laws, the way you ought to word the question is, are you opposed to expanding gun control laws? Then you're going to get a lot of yes responses as well. So that's the response acquiescence effect, and you got to realize that the yes response is going to get more responses. Okay, let me show you some other cases, other examples of cases where the question doesn't appear to be worded that badly, and yet it makes a huge difference how you word the question. So if we ask people, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? The United States should not forbid people to make speeches opposed to democracy. 79% of people agree with that or say yes to that. If you say the United States should allow people to make speeches opposed to democracy, which appears to be an equivalent formulation, those two things mean the same thing, well, only 52% agree with that. Now, why is that? Well, not forbidding sounds less like you're endorsing what they're saying than allowing, I think. And so this sounds a lot more like you're more in favor of what they're saying than this one, I think. Let me give you some other examples where a small change in the wording of the question leads to a substantial change in how people are willing to respond to it. So if you ask people, I'll try to make the type on these a little bit bigger. All right. If you ask people, should the federal government regulate business? It's 41% yes, 44% no. Should the federal government regulate big business? Well, if you're regulating big business, they are regulating big business. Now 60% say yes. So big business is kind of a loaded term, a negative term, and so people are more willing to allow regulation in that case. Is too little money being spent on halting the rising crime rate? 68% will agree with that, but if you give the equivalent formation, seemingly, is too little money being spent on law enforcement? Only 56% of people say yes to that. Is too little money being spent on assistance to big cities? 20% say yes to that. But if is too little money being spent on solving the problems of big cities, I'm not sure why you'd be spending money otherwise, 49% say yes to that. Huge difference there. So you're asking me, all right, which one is the right one? How should they have worded the question? And the answer is, I don't know. All of these seem like legitimate ways to word these questions, but as you can see, however you word them, that's going to affect the results. And that's one of the biggest problems with survey research. Very subtle changes in the wording lead to big changes in how people respond. And so if you don't report the exact wording of the question, you can make it sound like you did an unbiased job of asking the question, when in fact you did a biased job. So that's one of the biggest problems with survey research, is that small changes in the wording of the questions can have big results. The wording of the question is one of the major sources of bias when conducting survey research. Even small changes to the wording can have big effects on how people respond. Even small changes to the wording can have big effects on how people respond. So this is one of the most dangerous things, I think, for doing this sort of research. All right, last one we're going to discuss, the 8th factor to consider when evaluating surveys, is question order, the order in which the questions are asked. So what you'll see is when you're doing survey research, you're almost always going to be asking more than one question of your subjects, because it's expensive to get subjects. That's the most expensive part. And so when you got them there, you want to ask them as many questions as you can. Well, let's look at some cases where maybe question wording had an influence on the results. So, this is done by the University of Michigan Survey Research Institute, and this is a poll from the late 70s. Do you think it should be possible for a pregnant woman to obtain a legal abortion if she is married and does not want any more children? Now, in 1978, 40% of people said yes. In 1979, it went up to 55% of people said yes. And they do this survey on political issues every year at the Research Institute. They were really surprised by this because abortion had not been a big issue during 1978. This was a huge statistically significant difference given the number of subjects that they were running. So they were really puzzled that there was this huge leap from 1978 to 1979 in the number of people willing to say yes. So they went back and looked at the surveys, and what they found was, in the 1978 poll, this question about whether it should be possible for a pregnant woman to get a legal abortion if she's married and doesn't want any more children was preceded by a question about whether it should be possible for a woman to get an abortion if there's a strong chance of a serious defect in the baby. Okay, now this makes it sound, this is like a more serious reason for getting an abortion than just that she doesn't want any more children. So remember, 1978 is the one where fewer people said yes to this question. Well, the likely reason is that this seemed like a very serious reason to get an abortion, which made this one seem like a more frivolous reason for getting an abortion. And so fewer people were willing to say yes to that one because it seemed more frivolous. So here's a case where clearly the question order was making a difference in how people responded. I like this one a lot. So this is a 1948 poll. Remember, right after World War II, people were really worried, and into the 1950s, about the communists invading the United States. And so this was the beginning of the Cold War, and so they asked this question in 1948, right after World War II, should communist reporters be allowed to report freely from the United States? Only 37% say yes. All right, then they redid the survey, and what they did is right before asking if communist reporters should be allowed to report freely from the U.S., they asked, well, should American reporters be allowed to report freely from communist countries? Well, of course, everybody says yes to that, of course. And then if you ask people, well, okay, should communist reporters be allowed to report freely from the United States? Well, that just seems fair if American reporters can report from communist countries. So now 73% of people say yes if you precede it by the question about American reporters reporting from communist countries. So here are two cases where question order had an effect on how people responded. Now, having said that, of all the things we've talked about in here, this is one of the ones that has the least effect on how people respond, is question order. If you just randomly put the questions in your survey, it probably will not have an effect. It's usually if you're deliberately trying to set up a question, and the last one about the reporters reporting freely was clearly a deliberate setup, yes, you can get these effects, but if you're trying to be honest, usually you don't have to worry very much about that. Okay, well, let's see. We've talked about a bunch of survey stuff, and now I want to go back to this stuff. Why were the polls so wrong in the 2016 presidential election? Like I said, a lot of people were saying, most pollsters were saying Hillary Clinton had more than a 95% chance to win, and she lost. And we're going to talk about margin of error in a little bit here. But let's talk about this. Well, this is a case where the survey did not predict the election results very well. And the reason is because essentially of the sample of people who were chosen to complete the poll was different than the population of people who actually voted in the election. What you see is that Trump supporters were a lot more committed to him than Clinton supporters were to her. And a lot of people who are willing to vote for the Democratic candidate in 2012, which would have been Obama, particularly young people and black people, when they were called on the phone, they said they would vote for Hillary Clinton, or Hillary Clinton's who they were supported, but they didn't like Hillary enough to actually go vote on Election Day. They stayed home on Election Day. And so what you see is that Trump really didn't get a lot more people than Mitt Romney did, who was the candidate in 2012 for the Republicans. But what happened is that young people and black people did not come to the polls to vote for Hillary. They didn't like Hillary nearly as much as they liked Obama. And so they didn't go to the polls. They liked her well enough to say, yeah, I'll vote for her on the phone, but not well enough to actually go to the polls on Election Day. And so that's why you got such a big difference between the survey results and the actual results of the election when it was all over. Now, here's the problem with all this stuff that we talked about here. I would say, in order to adequately assess the quality of a survey, one needs to know the following information. How was the sample selected? How many non-respondents were there, and how were they handled? And let's talk about this one because this is an important one. So typically you have to get at least 50% of people responding to an email or a mail survey before a journal will consider publication. And so if you got something like the Haidt report we talked about last time with a 3% response rate, that should set off bells and whistles right there. I would say an 80% response rate is very, very good, and you shouldn't have a problem with that. But if it's below 50 or even much below 80, then I think you need to be a little bit skeptical that you're getting a biased sample. Now, how were the non-respondents handled? That can probably tell you better than anything what the quality of that survey was. Because the good surveys will not just give up after one call, they will try to call back twice before giving up. So if you see that they did 2 callbacks, that's probably the best. They're doing a good survey there. If they just went on to somebody else when somebody wasn't home, that's the sign of a bad survey. Also, you should report what were the characteristics of the poll taker, if they were actually interacting with somebody, because we've seen that can have an effect on the results. What was the exact wording of the question? So somebody tells you, yeah, I did a survey and 80% of people are opposed to gun control. Well, now, how was that asked? Did you ask people, are you in favor of more gun control? Or did you ask people, are you opposed to more gun control? Because remember, whichever way you ask the question, that's going to have an effect on the results. So you need to know exactly how it was worded. What other questions were asked in the survey, and in what order? What other questions were asked in the survey, and in what order? That allows you to look for whether one of the questions might have biased the response to another question. Now, you'll realize when you see a survey in the newspaper or in a news magazine or reported on the news, they never tell you any of this stuff. They may tell you the size of the survey and how it was conducted, but they aren't going to tell you how it was worded. They're not going to tell you the percentage of non-respondents and how they were handled, or the characteristics of the poll taker. You really need a full academic report to get all this stuff. So without all this stuff, you got to be a little bit skeptical. All right, so what are our conclusions after all of this? Okay. Many researchers argue that it is impossible to make absolute judgments about public opinion on the basis of surveys. Many researchers argue that it is impossible to make absolute judgments about public opinion on the basis of surveys. The methods used in the survey, even if appropriate, will necessarily influence the results. All right, conclusions. Many researchers argue that it is impossible to make absolute judgments about public opinion on the basis of surveys. The methods used in the survey, even if appropriate, will necessarily influence the results. So it seems like it's reasonable to ask the question, what percentage of people in America want more gun control? That seems like that's a question that has an answer. But I would argue no, that question does not have an answer. There's no way we could actually answer that question, because however you attempt to answer it, that's going to influence the results. You can do two completely legitimate surveys that are very well done, but that yield different results just because of differences in the methodology. You got to word the question somehow, right? But however you word the question, that's going to have an effect on the results. You have to have some order of the questions in your survey, but however you order it, potentially that could have an effect on the results. If you're doing a survey where they actually interact with a poll taker, that poll taker is going to have some characteristics associated with them that may influence the results. So that's what I mean, is that the absolute judgments saying, yep, it is the case that 68% of Americans want more gun control. No, you really can't say that, just because the methods you used in the survey are going to determine that you got that 68%. Had you done the survey a little bit differently, you probably wouldn't get 68%. So, is survey research of any value whatsoever? And I think it is. So here's my argument. This is, according to me, best use of surveys according to Dr. Cooper. And I don't think I get a lot of disagreement about this. I think most people who do surveys would agree with what I'm about to say. So the best use of surveys is to compare changes in responses over time or across different demographic groups. All right, best use of surveys, according to Dr. Cooper, to compare changes in responses over time or across different demographic groups. All right, what do I mean by this? Well, like we said, however you do the survey, that'll influence the results. But let's say, hypothetically, there was a survey on gun control done in 1980, and we know the other questions that were asked in the survey and how they were ordered. We know the characteristics of the poll taker. We know exactly how the question was worded. We know all the details of the methodology for how that survey was conducted. And so that survey was conducted in 1980. Well, 40 years later, 2020, let's say we conduct the same survey. We word the questions the same. We have the questions in the same order. The characteristics of the poll taker are similar to the ones in the poll 40 years before. Essentially, we keep the methodology the same. And what we find is, say, in 1980, 40% of people wanted more gun control. But in 2020, 80% of people want more gun control. Well, then, because we kept everything constant, and presumably there aren't any confounds, I would say it is justified to say support for more gun control has increased between 1980 and 2020. That is, we can compare changes and responses over time between 1980 and 2020 as long as we keep the methodology exactly the same between the two surveys. So that's one way to use them. The other is across demographic groups. And so let's say I did a survey I did the survey on whether people wanted more gun control. I did it on men. Some of my subjects were males, and then some of my subjects were females. And the survey was conducted identically on the two groups. And let's say that 40% of males wanted more gun control, while 60% of females wanted more gun control. Well, if that is a statistically reliable difference, then I think you are justified in saying more women want gun control than men do, because we kept everything constant except for the sex of our participants, and more women said they wanted it than men did. That, I think, is a reasonable way to use surveys. Keep the methodology the same, and then either compare changes in responses over time or across demographics. Okay, we got one more thing to talk about under survey research, and we don't have time to do it today. So I'm going to finish off survey research on Friday. So y'all have a good week, stay safe, and I'll post another lecture on Friday.